Good morning, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Paul Karitsis. Today we're going to be continuing with a very fascinating topic, that being oral history, myth, and Egyptian folklore. Now, history in the written form has only been around for about 5,000 or so years, since the evolution of a Sumerian script known as cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. History, as we know it, has also been recorded only by those who can write, mostly educated men until late, each with their own biases and opinions. What does this actually mean, though? Figuratively speaking, it means that the written records are quite like the pages of a book. Some have been scrunched, some ripped, and others have been torn from the book completely. In some cases, the ink has either smudged or what has been recorded is soaked with anything but the truth. The record of history is far from complete, and in many instances, eons from the truth. Taking into careful consideration that humanoids have been around for about 5 million years, it is quite ridiculous to think that the physiological growth of the human brain, which paved the way for the evolution of consciousness, has occurred only since the advent of the written word. In actual fact, it is not only probable but likely that humans had already developed a deep understanding of the cosmos many thousands of years before the first hieroglyph was ever carved in stone. Before the advent of writing, oral tradition was the only way that all forms of folklore, so myths, legends, and folk tales, could be communicated between members of the same community. These prose narratives were often told by people about themselves and soaked in the subjective appeal of local history. They concerned themselves with great folk epics, sagas, heroic legends, and balladry. This narrative form was an unreliable source of knowledge and was often distorted and changed as it passed from one generation to another. So think Chinese whispers. The notion that it was firmly rooted in the psyche of people belonging to all social divisions and not just to those of the upper class allows for a more accurate evaluation of the cultural views and values of a particular time. Oral tradition speaks for the masses, not only for the select few. We live out our everyday lives through speech, not writing. With the arrival of speech came the faculty of religion, a force that would pave and shape our perceptions and history. Religion would also dictate the continual evolution of individual and collective consciousness. The belief that a higher order of things has always been so firmly rooted in the psychology of humanity that it is almost impossible to pinpoint with any accuracy what prehistoric deities existed, in what form they were imagined, or with what ritualistic method they were venerated. This might tempt one to question from whence the major principles of religion evolved. The answer is quite simple: the sky. The first tribal people would have been awe-inspired and completely obsessed with this facet of nature, which occupies so much of the visual world, appears impenetrable and can at times elude comprehension. The dynamic forces of nature at work, so wind, heat, cold, thunder and lightning, would have been perceived as influencing one another and, more importantly perhaps, the events down on Earth. Natural phenomena would have greatly affected the fate of early nomadic people who did not possess the practical knowledge for the construction of nearly impenetrable edifices such as those that exist today. In addition, the two great lights moving through the sky, the sun and the moon, as well as the stars and planets, would have greatly impressed early sky watchers. After careful observation, certain recurring patterns would have been observed in the night sky in juxtaposition to its more unpredictable behavior during the diurnal hours. If the sky held within it the power to influence events down here on Earth, would it not be reasonable to assume that it held considerable influence over personal fate as well? This enduring fascination with the sky led to the birth of astrology, the study of the effect of the heavenly bodies on human fate. In prehistory, this celestial proto-science, astronomy, meteorology, and mythology were virtually inseparable. The sky became the home of the many gods and goddesses that would grace the pantheon of every pagan religion. So, for example, the Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus. Prior to the arrival of the monotheistic movement heralded by Akhenaten in pharaonic Egypt and upheld by the patriarchal doctrine of the Hebrew god Yahweh in the first millennium BCE. The primitive mind was quite unsure of how these deities who ruled over earth and heaven could be pacified or coerced. Ritualistic and superstitious behaviors were born, so sacred dances, chants, animal, human sacrifices, and performed on consecrated areas in hope that the laws of nature could be infringed for the better. These rituals were impossible to separate from the religious doctrines they were used to uphold, and were passed on from one shaman or priest to the next, and from generation to generation in an unbreakable chain associated with ancestor worship. Magical ritual often involved priests falling into trance-like hypnotic or hypnagogic states. They were also portrayed as having existed for time immemorial and handed down from the gods themselves. The shamans of individual communities became authoritative forces to be reckoned with when it came to political influences, as they were the only ones who could commune with the providential powers above. So, the Oracle of Delphi in classical Greece, given by the Pythia of Apollo, the first prophet of Ammon at Thebes in Pharaonic Egypt, and the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church at the Vatican City, are three of the finest examples of secular power held by the priesthood of state. Primitive ritual was closely associated with the explanation of natural phenomena, and to effectively bridge the gap between the two, the verbal arts were born in the form of storytelling. These first myths spoke of creation and the reason for being. Most of them were closely associated with what the primitive individual or group perceived as important. Many of the earliest tribes placed agriculture at the heart of their world, and rituals were conducted by priests in and around the times of sowing and harvest. Ancient Egypt provides one of the first examples with respect to a god of agriculture. On the island of Philae in Upper Egypt, the god Osiris was originally venerated as the spirit of corn who died in winter, but come summer would be raised from the earth, or spring from the returning waters of Hathor, the pre-dynastic mother goddess that personified the Nile. The events recurring down on earth were seen to be the lesser counterpart of those in heaven. The heaven of the gods and the earth of the mortals, two distinctly different realms, could now commune with one another through magic and ritual, sanctifying the same cyclic events of birth, death, and continued existence into the afterlife. Join me in the next video for an exposition on myths, legends, and folktales.